tensions between Japan and China have climbed to their most dangerous level since the end of the Second World War. The current crisis can be traced to a single moment on November 7, 2025, when Japan's newly appointed Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, was asked a direct question in the Japanese Diet: under what circumstances would Japan invoke its right to collective self-defense? To understand why her answer caused shockwaves across East Asia, it is essential to understand the meaning of that phrase within Japanese politics. Japan's post-war constitution, drafted under American occupation, contains Article 9, which explicitly renounces war as a sovereign right and forbids the threat or use of force to resolve international disputes. For decades, this clause defined Japan as a strictly pacifist state. Its military was deliberately not called an army or navy, but rather the self-defense forces, with a mission narrowly limited to protecting Japanese territory in the event of a direct attack. That framework began to shift in 2015, when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's government reinterpreted Article 9 through new security legislation. This reinterpretation allowed Japan to exercise collective self-defense, meaning it could use military force abroad if an ally were attacked and if the situation were judged to threaten Japan's own survival. While controversial, this change remained largely theoretical, until November 2025. When Prime Minister Takaichi was pressed to define what might constitute a survival-threatening situation, she responded that a Chinese invasion or blockade of Taiwan could meet that threshold. The wording was precise, but the implication was enormous. For the first time in modern history, a sitting Japanese prime minister openly suggested that Japan might intervene militarily against China, even if Japanese territory itself were not attacked first. The statement marked a dramatic break from decades of strategic ambiguity. It effectively signaled that Tokyo viewed Taiwan's fate as inseparable from Japan's own national security. In Beijing, the reaction was immediate and furious. The day after Takaichi's remarks, China's consul general in Osaka issued a threatening message on social media directly aimed at her, warning that if Japan stuck its neck where it did not belong, it would face violent consequences. Although the post was later deleted, the diplomatic fallout only intensified. China demanded that the Japanese Prime Minister retract her statement. She refused. In the days that followed, Beijing escalated pressure through a series of calculated moves. Chinese drones were flown between Taiwan and Japan's southernmost island of Yonaguni, forcing Japanese fighter jets to scramble. Chinese Coast Guard vessels entered the territorial waters surrounding the disputed Senkaku Islands, administered by Japan but claimed by China. Economic pressure soon followed. Beijing issued advisories discouraging Chinese students and tourists from traveling to Japan, a move Tokyo estimated could cost its economy more than $14 billion. China also imposed a blanket ban on Japanese seafood imports and began restricting Japanese businesses and cultural exports. One highly symbolic incident occurred in Shanghai when a Japanese singer performing a popular anime theme song was forcibly removed from the stage mid-performance by Chinese officials. Throughout the escalation, Japan's leadership remained defiant. There were no apologies, no clarifications, and no walkbacks. At the same time, Tokyo began reinforcing its words with action. Long before this crisis, Japan had already started to rethink its military posture. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's growing assertiveness around Taiwan had prompted Tokyo in 2022 to announce a historic plan to double defense spending from 1% to 2% of GDP by 2027. After taking office, Takaichi accelerated the timeline, pushing the target forward to 2026. This shift would place Japan's annual defense budget at roughly $80 billion, comparable to that of the United Kingdom and among the 5 largest in the world. For a country long defined by pacifism, where not a single self-defense force soldier has ever been killed in combat since 1945, this represented a profound transformation. To China, however, Japan's remilitarization cannot be separated from history. The memory of Japan's actions during China's century of humiliation remains deeply embedded in Chinese political consciousness. Japan was not merely a participant but one of the principal architects of that era, beginning with the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894, which stripped China of influence over Korea and forced the cession of Taiwan. The following decades brought further trauma: Japanese participation in the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion, the infamous 21 demands aimed at turning China into a protectorate, the staged Mukden Incident, and the occupation of Manchuria. These events culminated in the full-scale invasion of China in 1937, triggering one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The war left an indelible scar. Tens of millions died, the majority of them civilians. Atrocities such as the Nanjing Massacre and the horrors of Unit 731 are still taught, remembered, and politically invoked in China today. Against that backdrop, Japan's renewed military assertiveness is not viewed as a neutral act of self-defense, but as the return of a historically dangerous rival. When Japan was defeated in 1945, it was forced to relinquish all conquered territories and adopt its pacifist constitution. The trauma of Hiroshima and Nagasaki reinforced public aversion to war, while the 1950 US-Japan Security Treaty placed Japan under the American defense umbrella. This arrangement allowed Japan to focus on economic growth while outsourcing its security to Washington. Yet even under pacifism, relations with China remained strained. Japan recognized Taiwan's government until 1972, resisted military expansion for decades, and kept defense spending capped at 1% of GDP. Only in the 2010s did that long-standing equilibrium begin to unravel under new regional pressures. For much of the post-Cold War era, Japan appeared to occupy one of the safest geopolitical positions on Earth. The collapse of the Soviet Union removed a major threat, while the United States remained firmly committed to defending Japan under the bilateral security treaty. For years, there was little incentive to dramatically expand the role of the self-defense forces. That sense of security began to erode in the 2010s, driven by a convergence of four major strategic pressures that now define Japan's predicament. The first is North Korea. What was once a hostile but limited threat has transformed into an existential danger. North Korea conducted its first nuclear test in 2006 and has since carried out multiple additional tests, steadily increasing their yield and sophistication. By 2025, international estimates suggest Pyongyang possesses around 50 operational nuclear warheads, with sufficient fissile material to build dozens more. Equally alarming is North Korea's growing missile arsenal. Hundreds of ballistic missiles now have the range to strike any part of the Japanese home islands. Since 2017, North Korean missiles have repeatedly flown directly over Japanese territory, triggering nationwide alerts and reinforcing the reality that Japan could be targeted with little warning. The situation has worsened further as North Korea has deepened its military cooperation with Russia following the invasion of Ukraine. Pyongyang has supplied Moscow with vast quantities of artillery shells and, more provocatively, has reportedly deployed troops to assist Russian operations. In return, Russia appears to be providing North Korea with advanced military technologies, accelerating the modernization of an already dangerous force. For Japan, the implication is clear. A nuclear-armed, combat-experienced North Korea, closely aligned with Russia, now poses a direct and credible threat to Japanese survival. The second and most consequential pressure comes from China. While American military spending remains higher in absolute terms, China's military expansion over the past decade has been rapid, focused, and regional. Beijing has dramatically increased its defense budget, modernized its forces, and concentrated its power projection capabilities in East Asia. As China's power has grown, so too has its willingness to challenge Japan directly. Long-dormant territorial disputes have re-emerged with force. The Senkaku Islands, administered by Japan but claimed by China, became a flashpoint in the early 2010s. Chinese maritime patrols, air incursions, and coercive diplomacy around the islands have since become routine. China has also unilaterally expanded its maritime and air defense claims in the East China Sea, overlapping with Japan's own zones and increasing the risk of miscalculation. At the same time, China's missile forces have expanded to a scale that fundamentally alters Japan's security environment. Hundreds of ballistic and cruise missiles now give Beijing the ability to strike Japanese territory, ports, airfields, and naval assets at will. This reality was demonstrated starkly in 2022, when Chinese military exercises around Taiwan included ballistic missiles landing inside Japan's exclusive economic zone. The message was unmistakable: Japan is no longer a distant bystander in a Taiwan crisis. For Tokyo, the fate of Taiwan is not an abstract issue. Taiwan sits at the center of the so-called First Island Chain, a natural barrier that constrains China's access to the open Pacific. If China were to seize Taiwan, that barrier would be broken. Chinese naval and air forces would gain far greater freedom of movement, directly threatening Japan's southwestern islands and vital sea lanes. Japan's dependence on maritime trade makes this especially dangerous. Nearly 90% of its energy imports pass through waters near Taiwan. While Japan maintains large oil reserves, its liquefied natural gas reserves are limited. A prolonged disruption could paralyze the Japanese economy within weeks. The third pressure shaping Japan's thinking is growing uncertainty about American commitment. Although the US-Japan alliance remains foundational, recent political signals from Washington have unsettled Tokyo. Public statements questioning the fairness of US defense obligations, coupled with America's global military commitments, have raised fears that Japan might not receive unequivocal support in a crisis. From Japan's perspective, this uncertainty does not mean abandoning the alliance, but it does mean hedging against its potential limits. If deterrence fails, Japan may not be able to rely entirely on American intervention arriving in time or at sufficient scale. The fourth and final catalyst was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That war shattered long-standing assumptions that major wars of conquest were relics of the past. Japanese leaders openly warned that what happened in Ukraine could one day happen in East Asia. Public opinion shifted dramatically, with overwhelming majorities supporting stronger defense preparations. Together, these four forces, North Korea, China, uncertainty about US guarantees, and the precedent set by Ukraine, have pushed Japan toward a strategic reckoning. The question is no longer whether Japan should prepare for conflict, but how far it is willing to go. Faced with these converging pressures, Japan has moved from quiet concern to concrete action. The shift is not merely rhetorical or legal, it is material, strategic, and unprecedented in the post-war era. What Japan is now building represents the most significant transformation of its military posture since 1945. The most controversial change is Japan's decision to acquire long-range strike capabilities. For decades, such weapons were considered incompatible with Japan's pacifist identity. Yet Tokyo has now committed to purchasing hundreds of US-made Tomahawk cruise missiles, capable of striking targets more than 2,000 kilometers away. These missiles can be deployed on destroyers and submarines, giving Japan, for the first time, the ability to hit targets deep inside an adversary's territory. To soften the political implications, Japanese officials consistently describe these weapons as counter-strike capabilities rather than offensive tools. The logic is deliberate. The missiles are framed as a means to deter attacks by threatening retaliation, not as instruments for preemptive war. Still, the distinction is largely semantic. In practical terms, Japan is crossing a line that it deliberately avoided for generations. Japan's submarine force is also undergoing rapid expansion and modernization. From a fleet of just 16 submarines in 2010, Japan now operates 24, including its newest Taige-class boats. These submarines are among the quietest conventional submarines in the world, optimized for surveillance, sea denial, and ambush operations. Armed with advanced torpedoes and, potentially, long-range cruise missiles, they are designed to operate along the Ryukyu Island chain, hunting adversary submarines and surface vessels attempting to break through. Air power is another cornerstone of Japan's transformation. Japan plans to operate 147 F-35 fighter jets, making it the second largest F-35 fleet in the world after the United States. Notably, 42 of these will be the F-35B variant, capable of short takeoff and vertical landing. This allows Japan to deploy fixed-wing combat aircraft from its Izumo-class carriers, which are being retrofitted to function as light aircraft carriers. When fully operational, these ships will mark the first time since World War II that Japan fields naval vessels capable of launching fighter aircraft. While still modest compared to full-scale aircraft carriers, they significantly enhance Japan's ability to project power across the East and South China Seas. The southwestern islands closest to Taiwan are also being heavily fortified. Yonaguni, Ishigaki, and Miyakojima are receiving radar installations, electronic warfare units, surface-to-air missiles, and anti-ship missile batteries. These islands form a defensive barrier designed to deny adversaries access to key maritime corridors while supporting US and Japanese operations in a crisis. Japan is also preparing for contingencies beyond combat. Large-scale evacuation planning is underway for civilians living on the Ryukyu Islands. Logistics hubs, ammunition depots, and fuel storage facilities are being expanded to sustain prolonged operations. Amphibious rapid deployment units, modeled after the US Marine Corps, are training to retake islands that could be seized in a conflict. Despite these preparations, Japan faces profound internal constraints. Financing this military buildup is politically difficult. Japan already carries one of the highest public debt ratios in the world, and raising taxes to fund defense risks backlash in a society burdened by aging demographics and rising social welfare costs. Manpower is an even greater challenge. Japan's pool of military-aged citizens is shrinking rapidly. Recruitment targets have been missed year after year, and the self-defense forces lack recent combat experience. The psychological and political readiness of Japanese society to accept significant wartime casualties remains deeply uncertain. If a conflict over Taiwan were to erupt, Japan could respond in several ways. It could limit itself to defensive measures, focusing on missile defense, surveillance, and evacuation. It could provide logistical and basing support to US forces while attempting to avoid direct combat. It could actively defend the Ryukyu Islands and escort Allied forces without striking China directly. Or it could fully commit to combat operations, including long-range strikes on Chinese military targets. Each option carries escalating risks. Each also reflects a fundamental truth: Japan may no longer be able to remain a passive actor in East Asia's security landscape. Neither Japan nor China seeks war. Yet historical memory, strategic geography, and accelerating military preparations are creating a feedback loop of suspicion and escalation. For China, intervention by Japan over Taiwan would revive the deepest traumas of the past. For Japan, a Chinese victory in Taiwan would threaten national survival. The outcome is a region drifting toward confrontation not because any side desires it, but because each believes it cannot afford to stand still.